President Trump is hailing the rescue of a downed weapons system officer as one of the most complex missions ever attempted by the U.S. military. He says the operation to save the officer included 155 aircraft and deceiving Iran about where he was located.
So they had all these different sites where everybody thought he was located. We think we have him over there because they have 9 planes circling a little area that's 25 miles down the coast. So in a breathtaking show of skill and precision, lethality and force, America's military descended on the area, the real area, engaged the enemy, rescued the stranded officer, destroyed all threats, and exited Iranian territory while taking no casualties of any kind. The heroic F-16 weapons system officer had evaded capture on the ground in Iran for almost 48 hours. That's a long time when you're in tough shape and when you're bleeding.
I want to welcome in Lieutenant Colonel Dan Rooney. He is a decorated F-16 fighter jet pilot and combat veteran who is also a Republican candidate for Oklahoma's 1st Congressional District. Thank you so much for joining us on this quite remarkable day to hear more about the weekend journey. But before we get to this incredible mission, I want to hear more about you and your background and your experience serving our country.
Yeah, so my whole adult life, I'm actually still serving now as the commander of recruiting for the Oklahoma Air Guard, where I raised my right hand in 1998. Was an F-16 pilot the majority of my career, also a T-38 aggressor pilot. But I've spent a lot of time in the skies over hostile territory. And obviously, this is an Easter miracle. What we saw start on Good Friday, culminate on Easter Sunday. And it's so fun. Like, obviously, I'm an operational person. I just love seeing joint force come together in this kind of apex moment and hopefully give people, a little behind the curtain look on how heroic this thing really was.
Yeah, you've really helped us when you're explaining it. So we're talking about the details of this rescue mission, from the communications diversions to the survival tactics of the colonel who was serving as an airman to the joint operation to retrieve him. So many elements had to play out perfectly. What stood out to you? What impressed you the most?
I go back to like the joint force. So you had ground, air, and the intelligence component all working together. And a pilot, actually the weapons systems officer and the pilot, we'll talk about that too, they held up their contract perfectly. And as a combat aviator, the last thing we do before we step out for a sortie is we go over the seesaw brief in case we have to get out. And this is a very dynamic situation, obviously a race between the good guys and the bad guys in Iran in this case. And the pilot executed his evasion tactics while being injured in heroic ways, while the CSAR machine stood up around him. And your point, like so many layers that went on. One of the very interesting things that people don't really talk about is once we identified the colonel and the weapons systems officer up on a 7,000-foot mountain. So he scaled this mountain. He's injured. We want to get small and we want to get high. That's the #1 thing we can do as the pilot on the ground. But then the rescue op to get him, where we brought C-130s in to this agricultural airfield to infill little blackbirds. And then we set up what are called kill rings in our business as fighter pilots. So a ring of Reapers that basically was a 3-kilometer ring around the weapons systems officer where they're taking out individuals, fast movers like us and F-16s, A-10s, F-15Es, that are literally dropping bombs and disrupting the roadways up to this weapons systems officer. And then, of course, my personal heroes, pararescue, the PJs, which rarely ever you hear talked about. These are the specially trained individuals. You basically think like a Navy SEAL combat medic, but then they've got to take guys like me out of hostile territory that are the heroes that come out of the shadow, and their motto is so that others may live. And I just sit on that for a second, right, for everybody. Like, we're all in the business of killing bad guys, turning stuff into breaking bad guy stuff. This is a group, their business is saving the lives of guys and gals like me that end up on the ground out of an aircraft.
Yeah, and they did it. So the military trains for this sort of thing. We know this, and that's why it's done with such precision. But let's talk about the airman who was a colonel who used what's known as SERE training. So we're talking about survival.
Siri. Yeah.
Siri, thank you. Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape to try to evade capture. On top of that, he was injured. So can you talk about his survival tactics before he was rescued?
So a lot of people don't know this either, but as an aviator in the Air Force, you go to Spokane, Washington for 2 weeks of Siri training, where the hypothetical situation is, you've ejected over hostile territory, you have to escape, you have to evade, and you need to learn how to self-care, which this colonel did. When you punch out of an aircraft, you eject. When you land, you have what's called a seat kit. And in that seat kit that's attached to the bottom of your ejection seat, you have things that you're going to need to survive. So you have water, you have food, you have medical materials in there that he used to treat himself in order to get in a position to ultimately evade. And the other part of this, the Siri training that we receive, is specifically, at the end of this, how do you get rescued? There's a lot of classified stuff around this, but I can tell you there's a very disciplined communications cadence at certain times and points where we'll come up and down so the enemy can't identify you, but the good guys know when you're going to be up on comms to ultimately identify you. And a lot of the intel around this is the CIA was one of the critical links to finding this weapons systems officer on the top of a 7,000-foot mountain in a crevice. So again, like joint force fingerprints all over this rescue.
Yeah, talk about the CIA deception. You probably can't go into great detail, but it certainly did buy some time to find the missing airmen.
Well, yeah, and as we were putting things together, so you had the initial ejection, right? So this F-15E gets hit by a manpad. The pilot appears to stay with the aircraft while the weapons systems officer ejects. So they're a long way away from each other, which is a very rare situation. Generally, you'll go out together. So we pick up the pilot, which was an incredible story in itself that's kind of been lost in this heroic rescue, that an A-10 that was providing close air support actually gets hit with the first CSAR mission. It's so badly damaged, he has to eject over the Strait of Hormuz. We call it feet wet. They pick him up. But then the race to go get the weapons systems officer, and the CIA was incredible. There's a lot of intelligence. CIA, Israelis helped us on the ground create diversions while we were trying to build the picture of the battlefield and the CSAR op, but to keep them off the track. And as I mentioned earlier, Iran figured out he was alive, where he was, and they were on the way to get him, which is what set up this ultimate heroic rescue, while we were literally fighting off the Iran troops as we pulled the weapons systems officer, the colonel, out last minute.
Aaron, I want to play some sound for you from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He actually highlighted the efforts of the A-10 Sandy aircraft in the rescue of that second airman. Let's listen.
A note for those of you that do not know what a Sandy does. Named after the flight call sign that did this very mission in Vietnam, flying A-1 Sky Raiders and A-7 Corsairs. A Sandy has one mission: get to the survivor, bring the rescue force forward, and put themselves between that survivor on the ground and the enemy. They are committed to this. This is what they live for, and this is what they've trained for over many, many years. The A-10 force and the rescue force did a fantastic job rescuing Dude 44 Alpha.
Amazing. Aaron, let's talk more about the mission of a Sandy.
Yeah, so I've actually flown the Sandy mission in Iraq back in 2002 during Operation Northern Watch. And again, like this heroic CSAR mission of leave no man or woman behind. And so when you come in, your job is to identify the location of that survivor. And then we do what's called, we set a kill ring around them. Like unless we know it's friendly. And if it is moving toward our brother or sister on the ground, their job is to take it out. So it is a very dynamic mission. And in the case of this rescue, you saw that this A-10 was hit by small arms fire, potentially a man pad. We don't have intel on that yet, but it was enough damage to force this pilot to actually have to punch out of that A-10. And putting yourself in between the crew member on the ground and the enemy, and willing to risk it all. So so many heroes in this story. And we love movies, right? This story is better than any movie script you'll ever see, because it is real life. And I go back to the fact it started on Good Friday and ended on Easter. I'm a very providential person. And to get to be able to tell this beautiful story of all the people that participated in this, and the spirit of the scripture I always took to combat with me, which was John 15:13. No greater sacrifice than to lay down one's life for one's friends. This is just a beautiful demonstration of who we are and who's in the battlefield over there.
It truly is. So many heroes. Everyone did what they were supposed to do. It is an Easter miracle, but that training and that precision is what came through. If you were to meet those airmen, what would you want to ask them or say to them?
Oh, I'd give them a hug. Job well done. And when you're placed in these situations, our ethos as fighter pilots is stay ready so you don't have to get ready. We're so well trained, and you hate for something like this to happen, but there's a piece of you that, like, this is what you train for your whole life. And to get to go into hard places in life, and this is for everybody, this doesn't have to do with being a fighter pilot. When you go to the hardest places in life, that is where you build self-belief and self-worth. And everybody involved in this rescue on this Monday feels so good because they rose to that moment. And the self-belief and self-worth out of this rescue mission is something they'll have for the rest of their lives. And that's the greatest thing for me, looking back as a combat aviator, is what you come out of it believing in yourself, going to these really hard places and executing the mission.
Yeah, I see it in your eyes. You know what they did. Lieutenant Colonel Dan Rooney, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your service.
Well, it is an honor, and I would just say keep them in your prayers, right? We got a deadline coming up. We hope Iran comes to the table, but there are a lot of men and women over there fighting for freedom, and so every day, that's what we can do here, is pray for their safety.
Thank you.